Branch Secretary. Thank you, Ms. Broadnax.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce our guest. Sam Ford is the DC Bureau Chief for ABC7 and WJLA 24/7. In his many years of news reporting in the nation's capital, his focus has mainly been the District of Columbia government and life. He says, and I quote, he has covered everything from the White House to the crack house. Ford earned his BS degree in journalism from the University of Kansas. While at the university, he began his career in media with a job as a disc jockey at both the college and a local radio station. After graduation, Ford was hired as a reporter and announcer on both a Minnesota public radio station and an ABC affiliate television channel. He then studied journalism at the graduate level at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. He's a founding member of the National Association of Black Journalists. He has a number of journalistic honors, including an Edward R. Murrow Award, a Broadcast Excellence Award, and several Emmys. He's extremely interested in history, particularly Black history. He has produced many TV features that focus on African American issues. Ford's presentation today, Black Slaves, Red Masters, is his unique family story, which exemplifies the ASALH 2021 theme, the diversity of the African American family, and also highlights a seldom discussed aspect of American history. Ford's family is well documented in US government history resources. His ancestors are a powerful reminder of dark aspects of American history, as well as a commemoration to the enormous strength of those who survived. Ford's ancestors were enslaved by the Cherokee, who were participants in the practice of enslaving Africans. His ancestors joined their Indian owners on the Trail of Tears. During this forced move, millions of Native Americans and the Africans that they owned died. Today, Sam Ford will share details about his family's connection to the Cherokee Nation. Mr. Ford?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ms. Broadnax. And hello, everybody. It's a great way to spend a Sunday afternoon, I guess, is to talk about this story. You know, it was in the kind of the mid 80s, I think it was, that I was working for CBS News at the time.
Mama,
and
look, it's a sad face, because this has a dent in it. This is a sad face because it has a dent in it.
Okay. All right. So this was, again, it was like 1984 or something like that. So I went to CBS assigned me to do a story on a little community in Oklahoma called Bell. And what was interesting about it, it was a Cherokee community, and they didn't have running water. And one of the things that the tribe was doing was trying to provide running water to this community. The people had to go to a well. I mean, they drive their cars and pickups to a well to get water to take home for whatever they had to have. So anyway, it was just interesting. Well, amongst the people while we were there that I was set to interview was the chief of the Cherokee Nation. And this chief's name was Ross Swimmer. So after we finished the interview and everything, and I said to him, I said, Chief, you know, my family's always been connected to the Cherokees. I said, see if you can find us in your roll book. And he went and looked through and he found my father, he found my grandmother, he found my aunt. he said they were on the freedmen roll. And we said, freedmen, what are freedmen? He said, the former slaves. And I remember the crew that I had, I think they were from Chicago, they were wrapping up their equipment, and one of them stopped and said, what? You mean the Indians had slaves? And he said, well, you know, it's not something we like to talk about, but yes, in fact, we did have slaves. So this was the first time I had heard anything about this. And this took place in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is the capital of the Cherokee Nation. Well, anyway, I am from Southern Kansas, but my folks, my father was born in Oklahoma. His mother, I mean, my folks are from Oklahoma. Coffeyville, where I was born, is literally just, it's a border town. It's right on the Kansas and Oklahoma line. And so, and I had relatives there. So I called my relatives in Kansas to tell them I was heading to Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And did we have any relatives there? And my cousin said, yes, you do. And she gave me the number for Maurice Shepard, who's one of my cousins that lives in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. So anyway, after we finished the story with the chief, and he told me this thing that we were on the rolls for the freedmen, that evening I went over to the home of my cousin, Maurice Shepard, and his wife had this book. And the book was called Red Over Black. It was written by Rudy Halliburton, whom you will see shortly, who was a professor of history at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah. He told this book, inside this book, was an interview done in the 1930s during the Depression, when they needed to find work for writers. They assigned some of these writers to go find former slaves and to interview them about their lives and when they became free. And amongst those people that were interviewed was my great-grandmother, whose name was Phyllis Pettit, and her brother, Johnson Thompson. Now, I was a descendant of Phyllis, and this cousin I met, Maurice Shepard, was a descendant of Johnson Thompson. And I'd heard, family talk about, Uncle Johnson, that's what they call him. And I'd heard, they talk about Granny Phyllis, my grandmother. In fact, a good part of my life, I lived with her daughter, Tish. That was my grandmother, my father's mother. And a good part of my life, I lived with her, and she would talk about her mother sometimes. So, I was familiar with this Granny Phyllis. So there's a fascinating interview done by the WPA, these writers. And when my great-grandmother talks about how she was a slave, she remembers, being a little girl when they were freed. And that you'll again hear some of that as we move along. So anyway, that is the essence of it. That is how I sort of found out about it when this particular this article came out, and I was just fascinated. If you can imagine, you find out here's your great-grandmother you've heard about, and she's telling the story of being a slave and how they came to freedom and all that sort of thing. And so that is how it sort of began. Now, the other thing that's what's kind of interesting about this is that I knew we had a connection to the Cherokees because as a child growing up, both my mother and father's side, they talked about their, quote, Indian money. And what happened, of course, they were members of the Cherokee Nation. And whenever the government paid off the Cherokees, they got paid off too. And I didn't know exactly the origins of it or what it was all about, but I knew that, certain times, a couple of times, checks came from the U.S. government on behalf of citizens of the Cherokee Nation. So all of this will become clear to you as it became clear to me. We're going to start with a documentary piece I did 30 years ago. And what's interesting about this, 31 years ago, what's interesting about this is that all these people are still alive 31 years later, except one, I forget exactly who it was, but anyway, the main people, my sister's still alive, she's 93, Maurice Shepard, my cousin's still alive, and in this first part, as I said, that's a wonderful thing, these people are still with us after all those years as we tell the story. So Eric, I guess we can get started. We're going to look at part one, and then we'll eventually get to a part two, but this is the story of, I called it the Black Slaves, Red Masters, and it aired on Channel 7 in, I guess the year
The following is a new 7 Black
1990. That's it. Go ahead.
History Special, Black Slaves, Red Masters. Hello everyone, I'm Sam Ford. Earlier this month in our 7 Inside Reports, I took a personal journey to look at a largely unknown chapter of Black history when my ancestors and thousands of other blacks were slaves, not of the whites, but of the Indians. Well, a lot of people responded who'd missed some of the segments and who wanted to know more about the subject. So today you'll see it all and more, and get your pencils. At the end we'll have not a test, but an address and phone number where you can get more information. Every summer at Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee Indians sponsor their Trail of Tears pageant, the story of how the U.S. government robbed the so-called 5 civilized tribes of their homelands in the South and moved them by force to Oklahoma. They don't tell about the thousands of blacks the tribes brought with them, their slaves.
My mammy and pappy belonged to a part Cherokee named W.P. Thompson when I was born.
The woman reading is my sister, Elaine Ford Staton, but the words are those of our great-grandmother, Phyllis Thompson Pettit, whose Georgia-born parents were brought by the Cherokees over the trail. Johnson Thompson was Phyllis's brother.
Before that, Pappy had been owned by 3 different masters. One was the rich Joe Vann, who lived down at Weber's Fall, and another was Chief Lowry of the Cherokees.
My cousin, Maurice Shepard, reading the words of his great-grandfather. The interviews were conducted 52 years ago here at Fort Gibson, Oklahoma. Both my great-grandmother, Phyllis Pettit, and her brother, Johnson Thompson, were in their 80s, part of a federal writers project. Now, both of them are buried in this cemetery. But after I read their words, I was set on a mission to find out how my family became slaves of the Indians. I learned that beginning with the administration of George Washington, it was the policy of the U.S. government to civilize the Indians by teaching them modern farming techniques.
To adopt agricultural practices that patterned after the whites, and one of those in the South was slave trade.
I don't ever talk about it very much because I think it's a very shameful part of Cherokee history, and so I've purposely avoided involving myself in that whole issue.
While the current chief may be ashamed, at the Cherokee Museum today are slave bills of sale, including one for 3 slaves bought in 1841 by then Principal Chief John Ross. The chief and his brother Lewis were among the biggest slaveholders in the tribe. Indeed, many of my mother, Kathleen's ancestors, the Rosses, were owned by the chief's family.
They were Southerners. They adopted Southern institutions, Southern dress, Southern black slavery.
But one characteristic they did not like was Southern greed for their land. By 1830, through wars and treaties, the 5 tribes had lost most of it. Then they were all ordered to move west to Oklahoma. 4 of the tribes left, but the Cherokees took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court and won. At least they won the lawsuit. Then the man on the $20 bill stepped in.
And President Jackson essentially told the Supreme Court, you made your ruling in favor of the Cherokees, now, try to enforce it.
As president, Andrew Jackson controlled the army, so 14,000 Cherokees and 1,600 slaves were herded to Oklahoma, some groups in winter, with about a quarter of the Indians and blacks dying along the way.
You got plenty of Indians right today don't like Andrew Jackson in this area.
84-year-old Luther Scales, who describes himself as 1/4 black and 3/4 Indian, is president of the Coweta, Oklahoma Historical Society. He remembers stories his Creek Indian grandfather told him about the removal, which was devastating for the Creeks as well.
He said the roughest part of it was crossing the Mississippi River in a boat.
How so?
Well, man, the Mississippi River, down there in Arkansas and Mississippi, when you're talking about a mile or so across the river. And in a boat, as swift as that water running, well, you got problems.
Once in Oklahoma, the slaves were put to work, raising cotton, building the new nations. The Merle home, which still stands outside Tahlequah, Oklahoma, was built by the Cherokees' black slaves. And should you think the Indians were much kinder masters than the whites, listen to Granny Phyllis's words in the interview about my great-grandfather.
My husband was George Petty. He tell me his mammy was sold away from him when he was a little boy. He looked down a long lane after her just as long as he could see her and cried after her. He went down to the big road and sat down by his mammy's barefoot tracks in the sand and sat there until it got dark, and then he come on back to the quarters.
Oklahomans reenacting the Civil War Battle of Honey Springs. When it actually occurred, this was the Creek Nation in Indian Territory, slave territory, in which all of the 5 civilized tribes had signed treaties supporting the South. And the battle actually looked much like something out of the movie Glory, except it wasn't the 54th Massachusetts, but the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment that saved the day. Because of fear of attacks from nearby Kansas, many Indian slave owners fled south.
I can just remember when Master John Harnish took us to Texas. We went in a covered wagon with oxen and camped out all along the way.
My sister, Elaine Ford Staton, reading the words of our great-grandmother, Phyllis Pettit, a girl at the time of the war. In ex-slave interviews conducted by federal workers during the Depression, she told how her brother, Johnson Thompson, and her parents were sold from one Cherokee master to another and taken to Texas.
And Pappy done the driving of the oxen. I was set in a wagon and listened to him pop his whip and holler.
On the square of the old Cherokee capital in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, stands a monument to Cherokee Confederate war dead. But the war here was confusing. While Cherokee Chief John Ross was arrested by the Union Army and shipped to D.C., his mansion was burned to the ground by Cherokee Confederate General Stan Wadey, who just didn't like the chief. And while Creek Chief Samuel Chakotay fought for the South, Apathalea, another Creek chief, fought for the Unions, his slaves at his side. In any event, when the war was over, the tribes who'd all signed Confederate treaties were in trouble.
The United States government informed the 5 civilized tribes that all previous treaties are null and void. And the first thing to be accomplished is to sign a peace treaty.
The new treaties meant the Indians lost more land. And since this wasn't legally considered the United States, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had not covered Indian slaves. So the treaty said they had to be freed.
One of the things the federal government required in those treaties was that these tribes adopt the blacks as equal members of the tribe, their former slaves.
One day, old Master stayed after he ate breakfast, and when us Negroes come in to eat, he said, "After today, I ain't your master anymore. You all as free as I am." We just stand and look and don't know what to say about it.
The words of her brother, Johnson Thompson, read by his great-grandson, Maurice Shepard.
Pappy wanted to go back to his mother when the war was over and the slaves were freed. He made a deal with Dave Mounts, a white man who was moving into the Indian country, to drive for him.
Granny Phyllis described a harrowing trip in which they had to fight off wolves with fire from their camp, a wagon journey over land and water that lasted 5 weeks.
When we would come to a river, we would cross ferry boats, but me and brother rode on a bed in the back of the wagon, and when we were crossing a river, Father would make us lie down and wouldn't let us look out. He was afraid we would fall out in the river.
Finally, they arrived back to Fort Gibson in northeastern Oklahoma, where their father's mother was working as a cook for the U.S. soldiers.
My grandma, Phyllis Harnish, was the mother of the Colored Baptist Church on 4 Mile Branch, east of Fort Gibson. She organized the church and was head of it as long as she lived.
Since the Cherokee tribe owned all the land, as new Cherokee citizens, the family merely picked a spot. After Granny Phyllis Pettit married, her first child was my grandmother, Lutetia, whose 3rd child was my dad, Sammy. Pettits and Fords still own this land today. Our Black History special will continue in just a moment with more about black slaves, red masters.
Okay. I guess so that was the part. And I guess if you were able to follow all of that, it sort of made sense as to how all of this happened. And then one of the things that was particularly interesting at that point. So we were not citizens of the U.S. We were citizens of the Cherokee Nation. And the freedmen of the Indians had reason to dance.
Hold on.
No, they weren't rich, since they were now citizens of the tribe, and the tribe owned all the land. There was no need to sharecrop. Just stake a claim, build a cabin, and start a farm. And there was the black vote. Okay. You can make sure that this is out before I get out. Yeah, I was going to take a break between these two, but anyway, but that was the sort of the point here, is that there was a period of time when my ancestors went from being slaves of Cherokees to citizens of the various nations, either the Cherokee Nation. In some cases, they were in the Creek territory. They were citizens of the Creek Nation, and the interesting thing about it was, like, you didn't have to worry about sharecropping because, there was no private ownership of land. Indians didn't believe in that. Indians believed in that the land belonged to the nation. And so if you were a citizen of the nation, you just, found some land and started farming. It was that simple. And so it was helpful in terms of Black people not having to, kind of owe their soul to the company store or whatever. It gave a certain independence that Black people would not have if they were, say, in Alabama or Mississippi, if they didn't own their own land. And so that was one of the interesting parts of this story. And not as much in the Cherokee Nation, but you'd look at like some areas like the Creek Nation, there were Black politicians who were office holders, sub chiefs of in some cases, of the Seminole Nation. Blacks held positions of authority. So that's interesting. One thing I always said about the Cherokees, it's a very white tribe. And when I say that, if you look back at the chief, the principal chief at the time of removal, when they were forced out of Georgia to go to Oklahoma, his name was John Ross. He was 7/8 white and 1/8 Indian. That gives you some idea. And I don't think he even spoke Cherokee very well. So a lot of these cases, these were like, let's say, fur traders who decided to move into the Indian country, married Indian women, had children, and these people were more, let's say, white in their mentality than they were Indian. And that's why you have, I think, a number of slaves inside the Cherokee Nation. Now, there were full-blood Indians who had slaves, so, but at the same time, I think that one of the kind of the pushing of this was these Indians who were, let's say, as much white or more white than Indian. And the Ross family was certainly that. My mother's family, they were slaves of the Rosses, and Ross had about 300 slaves, if you can believe that. And the Ross side of the family did not walk on the Trail of Tears because, like rich people, they were not going to risk having their slaves die on the trail. Ross's Landing, if you heard of a town called Chattanooga, Tennessee, that was called Ross's Landing then. And the Ross family put their slaves on boats at Chattanooga, and they came to Oklahoma by boat, and they did not die. But on the other hand, the Pettits on my father's side, they walked the trail with the tribe. So it's kind of an interesting mix there. But anyway, so Eric, are we waiting to the end for questions, or do we take a break here? And what are your thoughts?
You want to go to part 2 on the video, or you want to take questions?
I guess we could take a few questions and then we'll go to part 2. If anybody has any questions on part 1, the early part, let me know. Any questions?
I'll turn it over to Dr. Jones, who's going to moderate this part of the program.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Ford. This is part one. I see Alicia has her hand up, so you can unmute yourself, Alicia. You can ask your question.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elisha. I am calling in from South Korea today. And my first question for you, Mr. Jones, is I'm sure you've done your DNA, and I would like to know if you have any Indian ancestry.
Yeah,
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
6.5%. Yeah, I did the what is the one called? 23andMe. That's it, 23andMe. And the 23andMe said I was 6.5% Native American, which is interesting.
Thank you. The reason why I asked that is because many
But that doesn't count for the
genealogists.
Cherokee Nation, yeah.
Okay, it is for the Cherokee Nation. Were you able to trace it?
You know, in terms of your ancestry, in terms of your being a member of the tribe, they don't deal with DNA. Okay, it has to be traced by records. Yeah. Okay,
so you were able to trace it. The reason why I asked that question, and I know because of the area in which you lived and grew, or your ancestors were in, and your family subsequently came from. Many genealogists say that the only way that you can have, for the most part, have Native American DNA is if you're in Oklahoma, and that the rest of us are pretty much European. And I just always disagree with that. So I was just curious.
Well, no, it depends on where you come from. I mean, I think you could be from other parts of the country and have Native American blood, but but they don't. But see, that's the interesting thing. They don't recognize that. The Cherokee Nation doesn't recognize it, and the only way it's you prove it through records. And back and around the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, they had something that they call the Dawes Commission, and this was a government agency that came there to determine basically who was a legitimate member of the tribe, because they decided that, unlike the tribal areas, they were going to chop Oklahoma up into private ownership of land. And so they had to figure out who were the tribal members to split up the land. And they interviewed the Black people who were there, who had a legitimate claim to the land. To have a legitimate claim, you had to have been a slave of, one of these Cherokees who had a legitimate claim. And in the case of both sides of my family, there was no real issue. I mean, they knew about it. In fact, on my grandmother's side, if you talk about Phyllis Pettit, the woman that you saw, she married, her husband was named George Pettit. And at one point they said that his Cherokee master was his father. And then they crossed out the word father and wrote master. You literally see both words next to each other, with father X'd out and master set next to it. But I often wondered if that was in fact his father. Because for me to have that much, after all these generations, to have that much Native American blood, he probably was.
Yes, he probably was.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And please forgive me, I called you the wrong name, Mr. Ford.
Yeah, and y'all just call me Sam. That'll be real easy.
Sam.
Just Sam, all right?
Do we have another question before we go to the second part of his presentation? I see no hands raised. Okay. Well, Mr. Ford, we'll go to the second half of your presentation and probably generate some more questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Eric, you can probably share your screen and restart the second video, I believe. There's a second video.
Hey, Graylin. I see somebody I know on there.
Hi, Sam. This is very interesting.
Oh, good.
All right, let me mute myself. Excuse me.
ex-slaves were called freed men, and the freedmen of the Indians had reason to dance. No, they weren't rich, but since they were now citizens of the tribe, and the tribe owned all the land, there was no need to sharecrop. Just stake a claim, build a cabin, start a farm. And there was the black vote. Witness this Seminole election in which they counted one candidate's supporters on the left side of the street, the other candidates on the right. To gain control of the Cherokee capital in Tahlequah, chiefs like Lewis Downing campaigned heavily for the black vote, as did Chief Spaichi for control of the Creek capital in Okmulgee.
The Creeks appointed and elected blacks as judges, attorneys. They were private secretaries. They were members of the council. And, of course, the 3 black towns in the Creek Nation had representatives in both the House of Kings and House of Warriors.
Silas Jefferson was even elected one of the Creek chiefs and was among the delegation any time that the Creeks had business in Washington. Since there was none of the lynchings or terror of the white South, Indian Territory became a mecca for blacks, even though many never gained citizenship. At least 25 black towns sprang up, some still around, like Taft, Redbird, and Tallahassee, where on a warm day they still bring out the kitchen table for a game of dominoes.
I'm out of here. What? How you get down? I'm out of here. Glad you did.
There were black lawmen among the Creek Nation Light Horse Police, deputy U.S. Marshals like Bass Reeves, who killed 14 outlaws without ever being wounded. And there were outlaws, killers like Cherokee Bill, part black, part Cherokee, or the Buck Rufus gang of Creeks and Creek freedmen. And there were the rowdies.
If they got enough whiskey in them, why they shoot the town up.
You ever had to run from a shoot-up?
I have crawled on bed.
My great-great-uncle Willis was among those rowdies. You may recall my great-grandmother Phyllis Pettit's story of how her husband's mother was sold by his Cherokee master.
He looked down a long lane after her just as long as he could see her and cried after her.
While George Pettit turned out okay, his brother Willis spent 1877 in the National Prison for shooting up the capital of Tahlequah. 5 years later, it was more serious. In March 1882, the Cherokee Advocate reported in both English and Cherokee, murder trial in Tahlequah, the capital, the Cherokee Nation versus Willis Pettit. The transcript still exists today. It seems 2 weeks earlier, Willis was having an argument with his wife Julia when his mother-in-law, Margaret Bird, said something, so he shot her. It all happened in the home of a sick woman that the 2 women were visiting. Among the numerous witnesses was one Henry Bowe, who testified that the day of the murder, Willis had tried to sell him his house and his hogs for $65. He said his wife had quit him. I said to him, "That won't make you sell your place. She'll come back again." He said to me, "That's played out," and he cursed and said, "I'm going to kill Margaret." While Willis did not take the stand, he had a witness, Maria Shepherd, support his defense that Margaret was trying to kill him. "As I passed her along the road," testified Maria, "she said she would have Willis put away in less time than 2 weeks. But the Cherokee transcripts say the prosecutor asked Maria, 'What relation are you to Pettit?' 'Not any.' 'Is Willis not in the habit of coming to your house often?' 'He comes there sometimes.' 'How come Margaret to tell you about this?' 'She did not like Willis and did not like me.' 'Why is it that Margaret Bird did not like Willis and you?' 'I do not want to tell about that. I am not going to tell it." The Cherokee Advocate reported, the jury returned a verdict of murder, and Willis, that is his name, was sentenced to be hung until he was dead, dead, dead on the 5th of May next. At a hanging in those days, the public came to watch, and the condemned man was among those expected to make a speech to warn some young person against making the same mistake. The newspaper reported Willis went to the gallows laughing. As for his last words, he said he'd made a mistake. He meant to shoot his wife, Julia.
What?
The Oklahoma Land Rush was the beginning of the end for the 5 Indian republics. 1889, Congress had given to anybody fast enough to grab it much of the land confiscated from the tribes who'd supported the South in the Civil War. 9 years later, Congress made the Indian governments irrelevant by taking title to the land they still held and sending in the Dawes Commission to split it up and allot it as private farms to the individual Indians and freedmen who were members of the tribes. At mass gatherings like this, they were interviewed to determine whether they were legitimate tribal members or squatters. In the Cherokee Nation, folks like my grandmother, Letitia Ford, had no trouble proving their legitimacy and received deeds to their land. She received 60 acres. My grandpa, John Ford, was a non-citizen but had access to land through Letitia and their children. The Fords, John's parents, Harry and Zerilda, had migrated from Kentucky in the 1870s, but Zerilda had died, and Harry had remarried a Creek freedman woman, gaining access to land as well. But some of the blacks had no connections, had not married citizens, but had established farms on tribal lands. Now, somebody was about to receive an allotment that included their farms. In the Tallahassee community in the Creek Nation, many of them turned for help to great-grandpa Harry Ford, a Baptist minister, and, says his 85-year-old surviving son Andrew, a prominent farmer.
My dad had a big barn, loft full of hay, corn. He once had sharecroppers.
But he didn't have gas lights, and that proved tragic when he came to Washington, D.C. that day, seeking someone in authority to help his neighbors keep their land. The October 19th, 1906 Evening Star reported the story. It said he took a cab to a hotel called the Philadelphia House at 348 Pennsylvania Avenue, which is where the National Gallery of Art now is. It said he asked questions around the hotel. Quote, the visitor said he wanted to meet some Baptist ministers in this city as he thought they might assist him to transact some important business in which he was interested. Then he went to bed in a room which had a gas light. My Uncle John Ford picks up the story.
Instead of him turning it out, he blew it out, and he became asphyxiated. Then the rumors are that he was really on to something, you know, that was going to benefit blacks, and maybe it was foul play.
Somebody killed him.
Yes, now that was a rumor.
The D.C. death certificate said Harry Ford, age 70s, cause of death, asphyxia.
He had $1,000 more when he left home. When he got it back, he didn't have a dime on him nowhere. Naturally wouldn't have. In the cheapest casket they could buy, and shipped him back to Oklahoma.
As for the blacks Harry was trying to help, they lost out. But all of his and his second wife's descendants received 160 acres of Creek land. They became targets for rip-offs by land speculators. And when oil was discovered on Harry's grandson Dan's land, he was essentially kidnapped.
Dan, they run him way out towards California trying to make him sell his place and all that. They called them land grafters.
Dan was no fool. He refused. Andrew said when oil was discovered on his allotment, he had no problem with land grafters, but later both he and Dan lost their wealth.
That's when they got Dan Tucker. The banks went busted and cleaned our ass out.
The end of Indian territory meant the end of an era, of 40 years of tribal citizenship for blacks, the end of centuries of self-rule for the proud tribes, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, Creeks, and Seminoles. The descendants of those black slaves and red masters after this.
Okay, I think. Okay, yeah, I think we can see that that was it. And of course, after this, the tribal government ceased. What proceeded and what followed them? The state of Oklahoma. And I want you to guess what was the first law that the state of Oklahoma passed. Senate Bill 1, segregation. And in fact, how do they determine segregation? Well, they said they had to determine, they said anybody whose ancestors came from Africa is black. Anybody whose ancestors did not come from Africa is white. And that was how they got the Indians, because the Indians became white as far as the Oklahoma government was concerned, so they could have segregation. But that's how they did that. And so as I said, it's interesting, interesting thing. But the first thing they did as soon as they got control was to pass segregation, and Senate Bill 1. That's what it was. Ms. Jones, I don't know if you want to start the Q&A, but
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. That was very good. I wanted to know if you came across the name of William Jernigan. He was a Baptist minister born in Missoula'ville, Mississippi, and eventually goes to Oklahoma. And he testified before the Senate against having Oklahoma enter as a Jim Crow state, he called it, in 1912. So I heard one of your ancestors being a Baptist minister coming to Washington would have been rather profound because the National Baptist Convention was very strong at that time in the
well, that
Central
was,
and
of course, this was, it was 1912, you know, this all took place in 1906. So, you know, it was a fait accompli by 1912.
Yeah, they were fighting for it. I mean, since probably the 1890s against the state being admitted.
Yeah, there were people who were upset by it, so upset. There was one group that was really interesting. They were so upset by it, they moved out of the United States. And there is like a Black colony in Saskatchewan, Canada. These were people who came from Oklahoma. And once this, you know, these segregation laws started being passed, they just wanted to get out of there. And I understand they still have descendants up in Canada to this day.
Awesome for our genealogists. Great. So I see Darnella Davis has her hand raised. If she'd like to unmute herself and possibly turn her camera on. We are recording, by the way, so it's up to you.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks, Sam, for a great presentation. I've had the privilege of speaking at this event before, and I noticed that you showed a picture of my great-great-grandfather and his two sons during the second part of your presentation. There's a cluster of a couple of rows of gentlemen who are Creek. And I wondered if you knew about that photograph because as I'm sure you could speak to, there seems to be a lot of good information and doubtful information surrounding who can claim their citizenship. And so the picture that you showed is often referred to as a council meeting. But in fact, what it was it was taken when the first oil strike was made in the state of Oklahoma. And my great-great-grandfather was then headed the Adams and Sapulpa Mining Company. And he had hired two prospectors, the Heydrich brothers from Pennsylvania. And those are the two whites in the photograph. To prospect for oil, and they had made the first oil strike. I think it was 1904. And so that photograph has been mislabeled and misunderstood in a number of examples, and it's often shown to show how Creeks looked Black or were intermarried, and that may have been the point of your use of it to show that Blacks, in fact, as you noted, were involved in the politics and held office, because my great-great-grandfather was actually in the House of Warriors for the nation and was also the Chief Justice for Muskogee Nation. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts in relation to that particular item that you presented. Thank you.
Well, okay. Now, is Davis your Oklahoma name, or is that Davis, come from Oklahoma?
Now, Davis, we've met before very briefly. I've heard you speak before. And Davis is from the Cherokee side of my family. My family is also descended from Cherokee freedmen, but my tribal affiliation is through my mother, who's Muskogee Creek.
Okay, because there was a gentleman named Napoleon Davis who was building a shrine out there, Black man. And that's why I was just wondering if you were related to him. In terms of those photos, the only thing I can tell you, is it's been 30 years. I'm sure that my interest was in demonstrating, and I assume that was the government part, demonstrating that there were Blacks elected to office at that point. And I'm sure I got that out of the book by Professor Littlefield called Africans and Creeks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Before you tip off, Miss Davis, could you share the title of your book? We had her do a book talk and she did something along the same lines of you looking at triracial persons. Could you share the title of your book?
I'll just show the book. It's right here. It's called Untangling a Red, White, and Black Heritage, A Personal History of the Allotment Era. It's with University of New Mexico Press.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. What I can see.
Go
ahead, Sam.
Allotment. One thing I was going to say about allotments. That was an allotment meant your piece of land. Okay, wherever your land was. And what was so bizarre to me was how they split the land up. It wasn't like they would necessarily give you 60 acres in they might give you 10 here, 2 here. And I remember seeing a piece of land of my great grandmother, 1 square mile of land, or 1 acre of land somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And I was like, how does something like this happen? But it happens.
Interesting point, because I know that there has been some discussion of retroceding lands back to Native persons recently in various parts of eastern Oklahoma. Has that impacted any of your descendants or your land that you still own?
No, not really. But, one of the kind of the interesting kind of family stories is, my father was very much a person who liked to be outdoors. He was a hunter, he was a fisher. I think growing up in southern Kansas, about 1/3 of the food that we ate when I was a kid growing up was something he shot or caught. When he died, all of our folks would go back down to this. You saw the old church and the cemetery that I was standing up talking in. Well, that was a tradition. The old Fords all went down 140 miles south of this cemetery. And so my father, when he died, I'd come home from, I was in Minnesota at the time. I'd come home and a bunch of his old buddies came over and said, Sam told us that when he died, he wanted to be buried at Hickory Creek. And I said, okay. I was very familiar with Hickory Creek. It was this old cemetery that was pretty unkept, it was overgrown. And I remember as a church group, as a kid, we used to go there to cut the grass because the cemetery wasn't very well maintained. And so we went there, and that's where we buried him. I had to tell you this story. We never buried anybody down there before. And so I called the funeral director. I said, well, Mr. Roderick, he wants to be buried at Hickory Creek. And Mr. Roderick said, okay, I'll look into it. So he called me back and he says, well, you can't buy 1 grave down there. You've got to buy 2. It's 2 for $5. And the county digs the grave free. And I said, well, my father always could find a bargain. So that's where we buried him. And my uncle died the next year, and we buried him right next to him. And I noticed in recent years, the Cherokee Nation has put up a big sign there, claiming the ancestry of their people in this Black cemetery. So it was interesting to see that happen. But
2 for $5. Wow.
But it was 2 for $5, and the county digs the grave free.
Yeah, wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. Have you thought to really expand this into something in terms of a mini documentary and partner with a university or a college to?
Not really. I mean, again, this is something I did 31 years ago, almost 32 years ago. So it was something that was fascinating. I wanted to tell the story, told it, and pretty much haven't done a whole lot since. Now, in the years since, there have been issues that have come up, particularly with some of the Cherokees who kicked us out of the tribe. I mean, they said, okay, we're going to have a referendum to kick the Black people out of the tribe. Well, okay. I mean, the attitude, I guess, of a lot of them who didn't even know anything about the history of the tribe was, well, why do we have Blacks in the tribe anyway? And why don't we, if they're out, there's more for the rest of us. So, if the government gives money or whatever. So there was that attitude. It was a really kind of nasty attitude. And they had, like you'd have some kind of vote around here, and they voted us out of the tribe. You know, the good thing happened. President Obama said, well, the treaty between us and the Cherokee Nation says that the descendants of the slaves are members of the tribe. So if they're not going to be part of the tribe, we're not sending you your $52 million. So suddenly the Cherokees were like, oh, wait a minute. So suddenly we were back in the tribe. Wow. I kept getting these letters here in DC, sometimes saying, okay, we kicked you out. And then, oh no, we changed our mind. Anyway, it went on like that for a while. And what we did, apparently you can't sue the tribe, but you could sue the US government for going along with something like that or allowing something like that to happen. There's this woman, her name is Marilyn Van. And for years, she was an employee of the federal government in the area of particularly of oil wells, things like that. I mean, she was part of the Department of Energy. Anyway, Marilyn, as she came near retirement, dedicated herself to this issue. She fought in the courts. And the interesting thing is we got pro bono lawyers, we got help here in DC, and the guy that wanted to kick us out, you know, and lose this money, the Cherokees turned on him, right? And they voted him out of office. And then they put in office a man named Bill John Baker. And so Bill John Baker said, okay, this case is going to court. However it is decided, that's what we accepted. And so because I live in DC, that gave them the authority to file in DC. They didn't want to file in Oklahoma courts, which, you know, Oklahoma courts, Oklahoma justice. They decided they wanted to file in Washington, DC, which, you know, is certainly an important part of any kind of legal decision. They filed in federal court here in Washington. Judge Thomas Hogan, who was, I guess, semi-retired at the time, he took up the case. And he had never heard this story either. It was kind of interesting because I've covered cases before Judge Hogan before. Judge Hogan was absolutely fascinated by this whole story. And so he took the case. And I thought, okay, we'll get a judgment here pretty soon. Well, it took 3 years before we got a judgment. But when we got a judgment, it was in our favor. And basically, you know, the treaty said that we would have all the rights of Native Cherokees, period. I mean, it didn't say, you know, until this year or that year or whatever. And so the judge says the treaty is still in effect. And so given that, he ruled in our favor. And Bill John Baker, who was the chief at the time, said, well, we said whatever they said, we were going to accept it. And so on this month of November, I think it was November the 11th, I can't remember if it's 3 years or 4 years or 5 years ago, after this decision, they had a dinner in Tulsa. And I flew out to Tulsa, and one of my cousins lives in Boston, flew out to Tulsa, and, you know, different people came, and we had a dinner of reconciliation between the freedmen and the tribe, the people that run the tribe today. We had a dinner together and said, you know, we're one nation. This is over. Let's move forward. And that is what has happened since. And you know what happens oftentimes is the stimulus money. The Indian tribes got stimulus money to use for its people. The Cherokee Nation got so much money that Chief Hoskins, the current chief, announced that they were going to give $2,000 to every member of the tribe. And so I got my 2,000. Everybody got everybody in our family got their $2,000. And so again, we were moving forward, and so far the people who are, let's say, who are for unity, they are running the tribe. But you know, one election could change anything. You never know.
As in any government, nation, sovereigns, what have you.
Sure. Yeah.
Quick question. There was a question in the chat about the photographs. Are the photographs from any particular location that you remember so people could go and look at them extensively? Are they online?
They were all over the place. You know, I spent a lot of time in the National Archives. just going through photographs. You saw some of them had holes punched in them and stuff like that. I was going for the information, not for the beauty necessarily. So, but I went to archives. Just anywhere I could find these pictures. Sometimes in old books. It was, as I said, it was just wherever you could find the information, and sometimes it was really kind of interesting. I'm kind of a pack rat. I wish I weren't, but I'd save a lot of stuff. And I remember at one point in my journey trying to find this story out, I was interested. You noticed the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment. I don't know if you noticed those soldiers. I wanted to know more about them. And so I was looking in some histories at the DC library. And this one history that was supposed to be on that era said that that the blacks didn't do anything of any significance out there, that they would run when the first, that kind of stuff. So I'm reading this in this book and I got depressed. I'm writing this story, and I remember walking home, or I think I walking home from the public library downtown on Martin Luther King, and just kind of being depressed about this. And I'm sitting here in the house, kind of thinking about this. And then in the back of my mind, it says, "You got something on this, right? Something on this you saved." Well, years ago, I had been at the Kansas Historical Society in Topeka, and they had this pamphlet called the Kansas Colored Regiments. And I went digging in my bookshelf and I pulled out this pamphlet, which had all these newspaper clippings from that era and interviews with the generals from that era, talking about how wonderful these colored troops were. Now, here is the information from that day versus some history book I found in the DC library. And I said, this is credible here. This is they're quoting, the general by name. And so suddenly I wasn't so upset anymore. And that's how I ended up describing it as I did in the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment won the day. And in fact, they chased the Confederates from Honey Springs, Oklahoma, back to Texas. Okay. But again, reading this one book, I was thinking that it hadn't happened. But again, as you're working on things like this, and as I said, I can still remember being depressed, and then finding out the truth and being so happy, and continuing with the video. And the video that you saw of that battle going on, we mean Channel 7 has an affiliate in Tulsa, Channel 8. And they had done some stories on it, and they provided me that video. So, I got video and pictures and just anywhere and everywhere I could, just collecting stuff and then trying to put it together.
Well, thank you so very much. I don't see any additional questions. Last opportunity for questions. But as a historian, and I trained in journalism, so we call journalists the first draft historian. So we have to thank you for that. We have a question from Adrienne Fikes, if she wants to unmute herself, and that'll be our last question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is really interesting. Thank you for this information. I'm curious, you're talking about the history that was in this book versus the documents that you had, the dinner of coming together in unity. I'm interested to hear what you can say about the kind of friction that seems to exist between calls for unity and the actual Black liberation, Black freedom, like equity, justice, and how are those sometimes competing ideas of let's all get together and move forward versus let's address how this has evolved into harm. How is that playing out?
You're talking about Black people who want to do something, or you're talking about Indian people?
Specifically within your group, the dynamic. What's really interesting is the dynamic between Indian people and African people, and then there are many people who have both ancestries.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested to see how because both groups have done harm to each other, and within your group, how are you addressing and reconciling that harm, or is it just moving forward?
Well, I think we're moving forward. And, one thing, we don't really know each other. I mean, it's not like we're dealing with these folks on a daily basis. I have met, for example, Chief Hoskins. The Cherokees, they move around the country, and they try to bring their people together. For example, they came here to Washington, and they let members of the tribe know that they were here in Washington, and to come to the American Indian Museum and get your ID card. So that was one of the things. If y'all have half a second, I could go grab mine and just show you what it was. I'll be right back. I know exactly where it's at. But anyway, that was one of the things they did. So the guy who was currently the chief, his name is Hoskins. He personally, you can see it's a card. He personally put this together for me, and they came to Washington. And any of the tribal members, if you wanted an ID card, they put it together for you, and you sit down and talk to the chief. And that was the idea, is to do this. And then they came to. They went to Atlanta. My son lives in Atlanta, and they came down. He got his ID card, because they were in Atlanta. And they let people know, through the grapevine that they would be in town. So the current group, we're part of the tribe. They're welcoming. They want this to be. This is what they want. But there's some groups who are the Creeks have kicked the blacks out of the tribe. The Seminoles have kicked the blacks out of the tribe. And then you got the Choctaws and Chickasaws. I don't know much about them, but and the Seminole Nation, the Seminole thing really gets me, because it's not like that. There is no language of Seminole, right? There is no, the Seminoles were a group of people who got together, blacks and Indians, to fight the United States. So these people came from different tribes, and the Seminole Nation is made up of bands, right? And it's 14 bands, 12 Indian bands, and 2 black bands. And it always has been that. So the fact that they would today kick the blacks out of the tribe is something that's obviously concerning, and the black people need to fight it. But in many cases, they don't have the resources. They don't have somebody like Marilyn Vann, who was willing to go toe-to-toe with people in court. And by doing that, we got our rights back, but some of the groups have not.
Thank you for sharing that context. I think that's great in terms of looking at the differences of how tribal affiliations vary from state to state or nation to nation. So I want to thank you very much, Mr. Ford, for your enlightening presentation. There are several very congratulatory comments in the chat for this. It's very insightful, and that you are actually a member of the tribe. That's pretty great, pretty amazing. So thank you so much for that. I want to turn it back over to Eric for our closing comments, and I want to thank everyone for their attendance and being here.
I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I know that you enjoyed this presentation. This is the level of presentations that we like to bring to our audience, and sharing our varied history. And I also want to invite you to go to the public library, and online or in person, and check out Dr. Davis's book that she mentioned. And her family also has an interesting history in terms of being a part of an Indian family. And I want to invite you to join us next year. This is our last presentation for 2021. The theme for Black History Month that the SALA, Association for the Study of African American Life and History, is going to be having is Black Health and Wellness. And we're working on a series of programs and speakers that will be addressing a number of those issues. And we want to invite you to look forward to that. and also to go to the National Asala website to consider joining. And we will be sharing information with our audience for our future meetings. And thank you for joining us today. And have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
And so with that, we will end. And thank you very much, Mr. Ford. And I will definitely put you and Dr. Davis together in terms of carrying on our continued conversation.
Okay. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
you. It's great.